So in a minute, there it goes. Yeah.
You're here with
live.
me, James Anderson. This is a Waywards newsletter video interview with David Rovics. David, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, James. Pleasure.
So we have some interview questions that we're going to roll through. I thought it'd be a good idea to interview David. He's been embroiled in a little bit of controversy as of late, and so we'll get to that. He's also an indie musician that I've followed for several years, actually probably going on a decade or two now. So big fan of his music, and I figured it'd be good to talk a little bit about that as well as some politics and the like. And so, David, I wanted to begin by asking if you could maybe tell me a little bit about yourself, those listening and watching, and maybe talk a little bit about your work as a musician over the past few decades, your politics, and your involvement in support for leftist and anti-authoritarian and liberatory social movements, labor struggles, uprisings, rebellions, community organizing, mutual aid efforts, solidarity, various initiatives for social change. I know you've been involved in a lot over the decades that you've been at it. So if you wanted to maybe go over a little bit of that.
Sure. I mean, it's on the face of it, it sounds like a big question, but I guess that's kind of what I've been doing for most of my adult life is sort of being a traveling musician and songwriter and writing songs about struggles that are going on around locally and around the world, and particularly in areas that I travel in. And so I've been involved with different social movements that and lucky enough to be able to be involved with a lot of different social movements in a lot of different places in my role as a traveling performer, and in my role as a sort of movement cheerleader, which is basically what I'm, what the role I fulfill, and the role that many other people historically have fulfilled as well, including currently. I'm not the only one doing this kind of thing, but it's a very much a niche profession that doesn't have a category unto itself, I think. But there are various people involved with this kind of this kind of like movement musicians, or at least people who consider themselves movement musicians, or are sort of put to use as such on a regular basis.
And so I mentioned the controversy that you've been involved in, or the back and forth online with some folks. And so you've written about that for Counterpunch, more than one article, but in one of the pieces that you wrote, you said the following: "We've got some serious choices to make. Tear each other apart in a frenzied, puritanical call-out culture backstabbathon, or find common ground and build a movement. The direction we're going now is down the toilet, as far as I can tell, from here amid the shit." And so I wonder if you could explain what exactly transpired in your life that prompted you to pen that piece, and why you see the frenzied, puritanical call-out culture backstabbathon as a real legit problem, and how are you holding up amid the shit?
I'm doing all right, but this tendency. I mean, I guess sort of backing up a bit, I would say, first of all, that the tendency of the sort of backstabbathon tendency, unfortunately, is not new. I mean, it goes back a long ways, and on what you might call in terms of what you might call the left, I would say it's certainly it's well documented that it goes back in much of the world, at least to the 1840s, and probably, further back. Certainly Karl Marx was well known for a lot of back and forth personal attacks with other left leaders and thinkers of his day. Not that I'm suggesting that I'm involved with arguments with left leaders, or that I'm or that I'm a great philosopher or economist or anything like that. But this stuff goes way back, and certainly in the '60s, from people of my I'm sort of half a generation younger than that generation, but from, people that I know from that, who were young adults during that period, the sort of criticism, self-criticism sessions and the sort of puritanical tendencies within the New Left were very evident in terms of these kinds of call out tendencies of pure, sort of moral outrage and impurity, and people being better leftists than other people, and the conspiratorial thinking about the sneaking problems within the ranks of our movement. I mean, this kind of stuff, I mean, it goes way back. It's not new, but in my own personal reality, I would say, although my critics might disagree, but I would say it dates back for me to the Second Intifada in Palestine, and the first time I started writing any songs about the Palestinian situation, and that started me getting attacked as an anti-Semite. But my current batch of sort of anarcho-Puritan critics, mostly anonymous Twitter accounts, but that are followers of a certain few luminaries within this scene. They don't necessarily fall into the same category entirely as my critics from 22 years ago, but they mostly do, and they mostly are coming out of a sort of ideological orientation known in Germany as the Anti-Germans or the Anti-Deutsch, and it's a very convoluted way of looking at the world, so that you can sort of, they, like the anti-Deutsch, they consider themselves to be communists, actually, unlike this crowd who seem to more orient as anarchists. But the anti-Deutsch consider themselves communists, and their main slogan is for communism, against anti-Semitism, against anti-Americanism. So that it's a mouthful, and it's a mouthful in German too, but they're basically, it's complicated, but these people came out of the left, but the way they orient is the worst thing that's ever happened to humanity is anti-Semitism, which of course as a German is a very understandable orientation, right? So you can see how this philosophy gets some traction in Germany in particular. But their orientation is the worst thing in the world is anti-Semitism. Germany is the root of all evil. And so we have to oppose German reunification, which they came around the time of the early 90s is when this political tendency came about, basically, is the way I would date it in terms of the anti-Germans. And they were against German reunification, and they were against German nationalism. And the way it basically, after a lot of schisms, the way it sort of morphed was they became a group that believed that you couldn't criticize anybody who was, you couldn't criticize Israel, and you could basically, they became a group that believed that basically Jews were beyond criticism, regardless of whether they were running apartheid states. It didn't matter, And then if it came to Jews or anybody else who was critical of an apartheid state, like say Israel, then me specifically, and then are then labeled an anti-Semite. But it's not necessarily for my opposition to Israeli policies. It's usually for specific words that they think that I, used in some context that proves that I'm some kind of an anti-Semite. So what they're basically doing is looking for anti-Semitism under every possible rock, And so, like, with the anti-Germans, if you talk about bankers, for example, that is veiled anti-Semitism, because apparently, as we all know, all the bankers are Jewish. And so if you're criticizing bankers, then you must be making some kind of veiled I mean, I grew up in New York, and I didn't even have any idea that all the bankers were Jewish. I had to go to Germany and learn from the anti-Germans about all the bankers being Jewish. I mean, I didn't even grow up with these anti-Semitic tropes. I grew up in a post-anti-Semitic society called the suburbs of New York. I mean, I'm not really familiar with anti-Semitism. I mean, my dad's Jewish. I grew up, among millions of Jews, literally, in the highest Jewish concentration area in the world, New York area. But, I didn't hear about these things. I didn't know capitalism and Jews had anything to do with each other. I learned all that stuff from anti-Semites later, but, and I'm learning this from my critics, because because these people they are finding anti-Semitism where it doesn't actually exist, which is like they're looking for it on the left in Germany, and now these people in Portland who come out of the same ideological tradition are looking for it on the left in the United States, and just like the anti-Germans used to do in the pre-social media era, the anarcho-puritans of Portland, whatever they want to call themselves, anarchists, so-called anti-fascists, and whatever they identify as, they're authoritarians is what they are. But they campaign against all kinds of people who happen, I think not coincidentally, to be critics of Israel, supporters of Julian Assange, critics of NATO expansionism. I mean, there's a pattern here to who they are going after in the name of anti-fascism. It's either a very, very confused bunch of people, or it's a bunch of undercover cops, or some combination thereof. And I don't know which. But if they're not cops, they're doing a good job for Mossad, so they might as well, be on the payroll. But if they're volunteers, then they're just extremely confused individuals. Unless they're actually right-wingers, pretending to be anti-fascists in order to destroy the left. But I have no idea what their motivations are, but they are doing a lot of destructive work on primarily Twitter, which is a platform that lends itself to disruption.
I wonder if we could maybe unpack some of that convolutedness just a little bit, or I wanted
Please feel free
to ask you. So with the anti-German pushback against criticism of bankers, right? How did they react to a movement like Occupy Wall Street? It seems like there's a not insignificant part of the left that levels those criticisms against finance capital for good reasons. And do they just consider like everybody who is involved in Occupy anti-Semitic, or like what's their position there?
Yeah, this is the kind of, it's the sort of thing that probably produces schisms within groups like the anti-German, tendency, and the anti-Germans, it's not an actual organized organization to my knowledge. It is now basically a tendency, a sort of a political tendency, but it may also be multiple organizations for all I know, but as far as I understand, it is at this point a political tendency, but it's I think a fringe one, but it's one that has more disproportionate influence, and that is exactly the sort of thing that they do is say like Occupy Wall Street to try to insert into the Occupy Wall Street conversation that criticism of the banks is anti-Semitic. I think that they were on their sort of not in a good position to make that argument with Occupy Wall Street in particular because of its New York origins. So that hampered them a little bit, because they're very pro-American and pro-U.S. imperialism and somehow
that's so weird. You would think that would alienate them from much of the left.
It does, but also the left is scared of them because they're scared of being labeled anti-Semites. Because like being labeled an anti-Semite in Germany is the worst thing ever that you could be called. I don't know if there's anything worse anyway. And, so people are afraid of these kinds of accusations, and Germans are generally very thoughtful people. It's a very, especially, I don't know what society used to be like, but certainly in the post-war era of, the past 30 years that I'm familiar with German society, it's a very thoughtful place. And if people are being accused of, even vaguely, of possibly being anti-Semitic, there's going to be a lot of people thinking about that and not just dismissing such accusations. People take this kind of stuff very seriously. And so it's very disruptive when these kinds of accusations are being made, as they are constantly being made by the anti-Deutsch, against anybody who is anti-capitalist or involve the global justice movement, which is somehow, veiled, anti-Semitism, or the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement is accused of being anti-Israel, and then, of course, anybody who's involved with organizing against Israeli apartheid or, pro-Palestinian. Well, they're obviously anti-Semites. So that's what they do, is they disrupt the left by making these kinds of accusations, much the same way as my critics in today in Portland do in the United States.
Right, and I want to get to the homegrown critics, although you mentioned that some of the ideological connections. But before turning there, I'm just curious how you got on the anti-German radar to begin with. Is it because you're a musician who plays overseas often and are outspoken on these issues, or what? Because you're based in Portland now, correct? And so not in Germany. Like, why is it they focused and honed in on you?
Well, just because I tour a lot in Germany as well as a lot of other countries in Northern Europe, and so basically after the first Intifada started in 2000 in Palestine in September 2000, and I started writing songs about the struggle there, and I got a tour of Israel canceled. Then somehow or other I got on the radar in Germany, and it wasn't hard because there's certain people there looking for anybody who's writing songs that are against Israeli policies. So that was basically, as soon as I started doing that, I got on a various bunch of different radars. I got on the anti-Deutsch's radar. I got on the sort of various elements within Israeli society, started sending me a lot of hate. And then I also started getting on the radar of the Palestine Solidarity Movement and of the Palestinian diaspora by writing songs about the struggle in Palestine that moved people. So I started hearing from a lot of different people, and it's been mostly a wonderful experience to meet Palestinians and their supporters from around the world. But I've also met a lot of their critics and their enemies, and have become an enemy of the same people that hate them. Although they package themselves differently depending on what they're doing and what society they're communicating in. I don't know who these people are or who they work for, what they're really doing. But.
So in your counterpunch piece, you mentioned that there are people you wouldn't bother trying to denounce because they're not running any countries or bombing civilians, and that you're much more interested in ending imperialism, which is, as you pointed out, your critics seemed less concerned with. But you're more interested in ending imperialism than in condemning some dude who wrote a fucking book that hardly anyone has read. And so could you contextualize that a little bit for us and elaborate on the importance of political priorities, which seems to be the assumption that's baked in there?
Yeah, I think that what has become of certain sectors of the left, particularly the online left, particularly the English language online left, has become a culture of denouncing people for their transgressions, and calling that activism of some kind. And this is a problem of I think not seeing not keeping your eyes on the prize. People need to have an orientation around what kind of society we're trying to build and how we're trying to build that, and what are the obstacles in our way. And if those obstacles in our way are other leftists that we need to denounce for their perceived transgressions or impurities or thought crimes, then we got a big problem. And this whole sort of orientation around people, not saying anything that you disagree with, because by doing so you're creating an unsafe space, and all this kind of gibberish that gets thrown away is just thrown around. It has nothing to do with what the kind of real, honest conversations and that we need to be having in this society, which are going to be creating a lot of unsafe spaces. So people need, safe spaces to try to create a livable society in. I'm afraid they're going to have to, hide somewhere, because it's not going to be safe, and it's. This is not the way forward. This kind of safe space activism. The way forward is going to be a lot harder than that. We don't need to be forming safe spaces that we are. We need to be creating a society that's safe for everybody. And this is the kind of work that needs to be done involves building bridges, not calling people out for transgressions. And people who spend all their time calling other leftists out for transgressions are doing us all a disservice. And you can see on the Twitter accounts of the people who spend much of their time attacking people like me that all they do is attack other people on the left, mostly. Occasionally they'll go after liberals like the mayor of Portland, but otherwise they're mostly attacking left-wingers for our various transgressions. And, they think that's some kind of activism. It's not.
And one of your perceived transgressions had to do with reading and discussing a book. Could you just briefly
sure.
mention that?
I'm an anti-Semite because I associate with people that are accused of being anti-Semites. So if you interview somebody who is considered to be by somebody to be an anti-Semite, then that makes you an anti-Semite, So that's my transgression is basically being a friend of Gilad Atzmann's, of interviewing him a couple times, playing a gig with him. He's a brilliant musician, and liking his book, The Wandering Who. Because if you like that book, then you're an anti-Semite. Because apparently, I can't figure out why, but apparently I'm too stupid to understand why that book is anti-Semitic. Because despite my fairly vast knowledge of Jewish history and identity and European history, I'm missing some crucial bits that, if I knew better, I would understand how this book is anti-Semitic. But, having read the book and having read various histories of the Jews and having read quite a bit of European history and having grown up among millions of Jews, apparently I'm still unqualified to say that the book was interesting. And, thinking the book was interesting makes me an anti-Semite. And then my other transgression was interviewing Matthew Heimbach, who is a former white nationalist who people say is still a white nationalist, and therefore for me to talk to a white nationalist makes me a white nationalist. And I would argue that actually it's very important to interview white nationalists because they fucking run the country. So if you want to talk to people that have just recently had state power and might have all kinds of other plans, it behooves us to understand who these people are. And there's and that's important to do also in public forums, I think. But the fact of the matter remains that I have never interviewed a white nationalist. I interviewed a former white nationalist who people say is still a white nationalist. So, and that makes me one too. Also, it makes me a suspect for being too stupid to understand that the guy is still a white nationalist, because for all my continual correspondence with him, I can't seem to understand why people say he's still a white nationalist, so that makes me a white nationalist, or just plain, really dumb or something.
This might be a slight tangent, but sort of as an aside, I have a real issue, or I do not appreciate attempts to, I mean, since I would call them censorious attempts to uh, to lambast folks for reading unapproved books, as if it's not possible to, take a critical eye and
Yeah.
glean something that might be useful, and then, also recognize when somebody's full of shit, or when, their politics are garbage, or when morally speaking they're abhorrent, or whatever. Like, I mean, just to give one example among, I don't know, innumerable that could probably be put forward, but like Heidegger, for example, right? He was a card-carrying Nazi, right? And the Black Notebooks make it clear that, there were some of his philosophy was certainly informed by his Nazism, but yet students, Hannah Arendt learned quite a bit from Heidegger. Marcuse definitely broke from him earlier than Arendt, but popularized Heideggerian Marxism, right? Like, he still had an influence on him, but not the Nazi part. Like that's a possible thing, right?
Yeah,
People
absolutely.
are capable of that. Like I think
Yeah,
sometimes, I don't know, like nuance just gets totally lost, and as does recognition of the human faculty for discernment. And so I don't know if,
absolutely.
and art, that happens a lot in art too now, and I guess with, the rise of, what you referred to as cancel culture, that's becoming an issue. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that too, especially from the artist's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, this is basically what we're talking about in terms of these kinds of campaigns. So the thing is that because I have made these transgressions of talking to the wrong people and refusing to abjectly, apologize about it enough, and recognize the rightness of my critics in their views on Gilad Atzmon and Matthew Heimbach. So that makes me, persona non grata, and that makes me someone who should be canceled. And so these people, and I'm not casting, accusations without any merit. I have vast public documentation of this, including lots, 200 megabytes worth of screenshots in case they want to delete their Twitter accounts. They can all feel free to. But what has been, abundantly documented, is that there are people engaged in coordinated activities online to try to ruin people's lives and careers. And they do this intentionally. They coordinate. And furthermore, I have personally known lots of people who have been involved with such campaigns who think that this is, a great thing to do. Although to be, the people that I personally know who have been involved with such campaigns have been specifically targeting the far right. So, and they've been doing exactly the kind of stuff that these people are doing to me. So I'm very familiar with this kind of stuff because although I have never engaged in these kinds of activities myself, and I have a lot of issues with trolling for whatever purpose, and for these kinds of like cancellation campaigns, no matter who you are trying to go after. I think it's especially abhorrent when you are somebody claiming to be a leftist, conducting a cancellation campaign against another leftist. But I think it's basically a bad tactic generally. But in this particular kind of instance, it's just such a classic circular firing squad kind of thing. But the stuff they do, they do to a lot of different people. A lot of different people have had these continue to have these kinds of experiences, often, involving the same little troll farm that attacks me. But, there's lots of other people who join in these kinds of campaigns, which is why these campaigns can be so powerful and why Twitter is such a good platform for these campaigns, because you can have such influence by just, you can have 14 followers on Twitter, but if you tag people and you know how to use the platform, you can make a lot of noise. And and they're good at it. And then once they got a bunch of people saying, "Oh, this guy said this and he's really dumb, and how could anybody say that?" And anybody who says that and is an anti-Semite, people see that and they're like, "Oh yeah, yeah, that makes sense," and then they agree, without having any idea of the background or whether this statement is really true or not. There's certain people out there who want to believe that that there is this phenomenon of artists and intellectuals and other folks just like selling out and going to the dark side. This kind of thing doesn't really actually happen much, as far as I know. Usually if somebody's one way politically to begin with, they're probably not going to just, in their adult life, if they're over the age of 30, they're probably not going to make some radical change from fascist to communist or the other way around. They probably have a background that led them to certain kind of conclusions that like solidarity is the way to go, or that, white supremacy is the way to go. And, they're not going to like change that orientation. It's kind of deep rooted kind of stuff, but there's a certain group of people who has this kind of, I don't know what it's all about, but they want to know, they want to think that they have some kind of secret that other people don't have, and these these people, some people can just sell out somehow, they sell their souls and turn to the dark side, and there's this whole discourse that you can find on Twitter and elsewhere that's very popular. That like, oh, that person, he used to be left wing, but now he's fash. Like, oh, okay, really? You say so I guess it must be true.
And so back in early February, the Portland chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, tweeted the following: "Thank you to everyone who raised concerns about David Rovix being on the program for today's 2 p.m. rally at City Hall. He will not be performing. Please join us to support city workers." So I wonder if you could provide any context that might help us understand what was going on, the invitation that you initially received, as well as how and why you were uninvited by the DSA there, and what is your relationship to the DSA now? And then I'm just curious what your assessment is of the national organization as well as the local chapter there in Portland in terms of its political ideas and practice and organizing.
So basically, I've been singing at labor rallies in Portland and around the world for a long time, for decades, on a regular basis. Usually a hell of a lot more labor rallies outside of the U.S. than inside the U.S. because the labor movement in the U.S. tends to be pretty anemic until recently. But I sang at a fair number of labor events, and I was invited to sing at a labor rally at City Hall for the city workers who were considering going on strike. And I wrote a song for the occasion, which the folks liked and which got used on various labor radio shows around the country. And I was going to sing at this rally, and then as I had done just 2 weeks earlier at another labor rally for the city workers that was also organized or co-organized by DSA, the DSA chapter. And then but then I think it was actually hours before the rally, the DSA chapter started getting bombarded with messages on Twitter about how I'm a Holocaust-denying anti-Semite. And this was a campaign led by the same troll farmers that are constantly attacking me, particularly this guy at Hazel on Twitter, who Heyzell. This guy is completely dedicated to ruining my career, as is obvious if you look at his presence on Twitter. And so he was going after the DSA and tagging them with all kinds of posts about how they're having this terrible anti-Semite play at their rally, and basically making them feel like it was not safe to have me play at the rally. Which is very ironic because Hazel apparently claims to be Jewish and claims that because of his Jewishness, he's unsafe being around an anti-Semite like me, which is just the most bizarre thing I've ever heard. But people believe that. kind of nonsense, because they believe this, like, you have to believe the victim. It's this insanity of this sort of believe the victim idea taken to the most ridiculous extreme you can imagine, which is of course,
and self-identified victim oftentimes, right? Not even objectively victimized, and actually not in most cases.
No, if you really truly believe completely, in a very American way that only Americans can do, like this complete puritanical beliefs, that just completely tunnel mind, like horse blinder kind of belief in the concept of believe the victim, because we Americans, we have to take everything to its logical ridiculous extreme, like beyond where it ever had any useful concept. Of course, the idea of believing the victim is a very important thing. And of course, so many actual victims haven't been believed. Of course, when we're talking about children, victims, and women, all sorts of people, are victimized in all kinds of ways systematically, and tend not to be believed by the people that need to be believing them, And of course, that's a very, very real phenomenon. But the way that
logic carries over to you.
Yeah, the way that logic carries over to me and to so many other people online in the Nexus, as the hosts of the podcast Fucking Canceled, they call this the whole scene the Nexus. And I think that it's good to have a word for this, people, because in cancel culture, it's overused, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can call, and it's also, we're talking about a sort of a subset of society that believes in that attacking fellow leftists on Twitter is a form of activism. So, when you're talking about this subset, we know who we're talking about, but it's a certain subset of society that we're talking about. You can call it what you want. We can call it whatever we want, but I think calling it cancel culture is just doesn't really work when we're talking about the whole subset, because it's not that all these people are involved with cancellation campaigns on a constant basis. It's that we're talking about people who believe that this kind of thing is good, even whether or not they're involved with it. People who don't see that, organized campaigns to ruin somebody's life is not a form of activism. Like, it's not a good thing to do that. It's not the way forward to build a movement, to like sort of take out elements of the movement, I mean, what they're doing in Germany, by the way, the anti-Deutsch, or what's morphed into the new whatever they call themselves, the people involved with the movement against the coal mining in Western Germany, now they're putting out this idea that white people with dreadlocks are racist. So, because somehow, letting your hair dread if you're white is cultural appropriation and therefore racist, and therefore these terrible racist people shouldn't be allowed to participate in the environmental movement. And like, if anybody's been involved with environmental, radical environmental movements, like people that occupy, coal operations and climb trees and prevent logging from happening, it's overwhelmingly white people, and a hell of a lot of them are white people with dreadlocks.
Yeah, they're
and that's just as true in the United States or Germany. So if if you're going to try to divide the movement, just randomly come up with this bullshit about dreadlocks being racist, and then then you've just created. It's like throwing a grenade into, because of course these people are all very sensitive about accusations of racism. They take this stuff seriously. These are good folks, these are well-meaning, progressive folks who want to stop a coal mine. Of course, they're not going to just think that these accusations of racism mean nothing. That's serious stuff to accuse people of racism. And then so what does that do? That just, it's so destructive. And which is not to say that you can't be racist with it on the left, of course.
Yeah, that's the point.
But that doesn't mean, but then you don't solve that problem. Sorry, what's that?
I just wondered if you could maybe help me parse out how you view this, because going back, you mentioned the activism in the 1960s, like thinking about Students for Democratic Society, for example, right? And how there was a lot of inner conflict that emerged and unnecessary self-criticism. But there was also, I think a lot of people would argue, necessary self-criticism or criticism within the movement and within that specific organization too, right? Because it was male dominated, and of course there's history of racism within the labor movement. So these things have existed, but that but there's a difference between identifying like legitimate aspects of racism or patriarchy or whatever in those practices and trying to deal with those versus casting a net where it doesn't apply. And so I wondered if you could, like, how do you parse that out personally?
I think that these kinds of when there are problems within movements and organizations, it's really important to work on those problems and for people to progress as human beings, and that is vitally important. And there are ways to make that happen and ways to make that not happen. And the way not to make that happen is to turn your movement into a acidic kind of like environment where people don't trust each other and they're constantly making personal attacks against each other in public forums for their perceived transgressions. That is not the way forward. The way forward is much more difficult and much more demanding, and it involves actually, having personal relationships with people that you have problems with, and working those problems out within organizations, not just casting aspersions into the Twitter sphere, which is just, there's nothing even remotely resembling accountability involved with just casting aspersions onto public forums on corporate social media platforms. I mean, if you want to actually work stuff out and hold people accountable for actual bad things or actual real transgressions, then there's all kinds of ways to do that effectively that hopefully don't destroy groups and don't destroy movements. But if you're going about trying to destroy a movement or destroy a group, then you're obviously not going to be concerned with how the accusations you throw around are going to impact the groups, because that's not your concern. But if your concern is actually a movement that is actually building and growing and thriving, then you need to think about that before you just go trying to take down anybody who seems to have a little bit more influence or power than you have, which seems to be largely what's going on here. I mean, it's complicated because, of course, people do have all kinds of issues that need to be resolved, and sexism and racism and transphobia and all these things are very real, and even anti-Semitism is real, even though it's not nearly the kind of problem that on the left that these people want to think that it is.
Do you think that, because I mean, there's arguably been a resurgence in fascist sensibilities or proto-fascist sensibilities, if you'd rather, right? And so I wondered if you think anti-Semitism has been growing in the U.S. as of late, even if it's still relatively marginal, and if that maybe accounts for some of the popularity of the luminaries who have championed the David Rovick's criticism, or how do you see that?
I mean, there's all kinds of weird people out there, including far-right anti-Semites. But so, I mean, just to be clear, the point that I tend to be making with my wingnut attackers is that anti-Semitism on the left is not the kind of problem that they think it is. In fact, it's not a problem at all, really.
On the left.
On the left, specifically. But whether anti-Semitism is growing or not, I don't know. But definitely the far right is growing. And the far right, I think today has a lot of different characteristics than the far right used to have. And my impression generally is for many people in the far right, at least in the sort of Trump camp of the far right, Jews are not the problem. I don't think Trump thinks Jews are the problem, but he has other enemies, like China. And but fascism is a flexible kind of thing because it's an opportunistic phenomenon in the first place. National Socialism, which is what fascism is, and what the Germans always, the German fascists always wanted to be called National Socialists. They often eschewed the term Nazis, preferring National Socialism because they really wanted to emphasize that what they were advocating was a variety of socialism, and they wanted to put that out there because socialism was very popular, and they knew socialism was very popular. But the nationalism was also potentially something that was popular, and so they could throw the nationalism in with the socialism. But you can do that in all kinds of different ways. It doesn't need to be something where your scapegoat is a particular group. You don't have to always scapegoat the Jews. That's just something that Europeans have been doing for the past 1,000 years. You don't have to do that. You can scapegoat blacks too. That's a much more American thing to do, is to
immigrants, refugees,
black and brown people, immigrants, refugees. Yeah, that's who we scapegoat in the United States. We don't really do the Jewish thing so much anymore.
I was just thinking, the demonstrations in Charlottesville, there certainly seemed to be elements of anti-Semitism present there that were Trumpist in nature, but I don't know how much that accounts for that movement overall, if you want to call it that. So
I think, those guys, the far right exists, and it certainly showed some, it had a demonstration that, how many people did they have there in Charlottesville? 1,500 or something? I wasn't there, but I think, the far right has demonstrations in Germany that are 3 or 4 times bigger than that Charlottesville demo every few months. And, the far right, I would say, in the United States is really not very well organized compared to a lot of other countries. But when we're talking about the real serious, the sort of Nazi far right, the anti-Semitic, and the ones who hate everybody, those, but when we're talking about
really well organized, but the extreme,
the right is well organized, but I would differentiate between. Yeah, I would say there is a distinction, and it may be a fraying one. It may be a hard one to define, but I think there's a distinction between these groups, like the National Socialist Movement, groups like that, and your average Trump supporter, gun collecting Trump supporter. This is, but so when we're talking about the right, and when we're talking about Trump, who is one of the most popular people in the United States today, and is probably going to be the next president of the U.S. again. I think that Jared, what's his name? His Kirshner. Yeah, he's more representative of what Trump stands for than the National Socialist Movement. Trump is not going after Jews. That's not his thing. And I don't know if I don't necessarily know if he has any interest in rounding people up and gassing them either. I don't think he's necessarily that kind of. I don't think. I could be wrong. I just don't think that that's necessarily Trump's plan. I don't think that's his thing. I think that the popularity of the right, and here again, I would really distinguish between the right and the far right, but the popularity of the right, not counting the maybe like less than 1% fringe of real Nazis. But the popularity of the right in the United States, when we're talking about people like Trump, and the popularity of the right in France, when we're talking about Le Pen, and also India, when we're talking about Modi and Bolsonaro in Brazil, and so many others, it is not primarily a phenomenon that is inspired by racism or xenophobia. It uses all these right-wing movements use xenophobia and racism to their benefit, but I think that people are generally driven by poverty, despair, hopelessness, and a feeling that things are getting worse. Like the average Trump voter was somebody whose income declined over the previous 10 years. I mean, that was the most biggest factor that determined who voted for Trump, because he got a lot of votes from women and black and brown people too, contrary to popular mythology. And what determined who voted for him was largely were they people whose livelihoods were declining. But I think that's true of the popularity of right-wing movements all around the world. I mean, that's, and that was also a massive part of the popularity of the National Socialist movement in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. Sure. It was not necessarily driven then either by xenophobia or racism or anti-Semitism. It certainly used those things, and certainly Hitler was a rabid anti-Semite who had all kinds of wild ideas, which he actually carried out about, killing millions of people for nothing but their ethnic background. That actually all really happened.
Or
what's that?
I said
or other crimes like being communist, being gay, being handicapped.
Not to diminish the genocidal anti-Semitism, but
I mean, a disproportionately large number of the victims were Jewish, and the Jews were generally treated the worst. But it's levels of horror and. But
go ahead.
Yeah, I think, but the movement of National Socialism at the time was, I think, and I mean, I think history bears it out, that in terms of what people were motivated by and what people are motivated by today, which is, they want to survive, they want to prosper, and generally, you're talking about societies where the Social Democrats, or their equivalent in the United States, we're talking about FDR and the Democratic Party. In other countries, we're talking about other parties. But the Social Democrat type tendency, when it's in power, or Lula in Brazil, or in recent years, the Congress Party in India. When the Social Democrats, when they don't serve the interests of the working class, when they consistently fail to serve the interests of the working class, when the working class, the majority in every society, any society, the working class is the majority. When the working class, when their livelihood continually declines under the administration of these Social Democrats, ultimately people get fed up with it, and they, no matter how many times they're told, nobody's going to represent your class interests better than Social Democrats, they're like, well, fuck it, they're not doing a good job here. So, if they have the option of voting for a further left party, like say in Denmark today, where Enhedslisten is now, the Unity List is now the third biggest party. I mean, they'll vote for left-wing parties. But if the left-wing parties don't seem to be viable, there's a lot of people who, for whatever reason, and I know many of us on the left who have grown up on the left and have a left-wing analysis of history and reality, we have trouble imagining why this is. But the fact is that there are millions and millions of people in every society around the world who, when they don't have options that seem viable on the left, and when the Social Democrats or their equivalent have been stabbing them the back for the past 50 years, they actually will vote for the far right. Mm-hmm. And that's what they did in the United States when they elected Trump, and that's what they did in India when they elected Modi, and that's what they did in Brazil when they elected Bolsonaro, and that's what they did in Hungary when they elected Orbán. And this is not rocket science, and that's why people love Putin as well.
And I would probably go so far as to suggest that the shift rightward also occurs when not only is there an absence of a strong electoral left, but also the absence of a strong, leftist social movement, underpinning things, or absence of a really strong labor movement and that sort of thing too. Just to try
Absolutely.
to connect to the grassroots, to what's going on at the ballot box and at the nation state level.
Absolutely, especially in the United States, especially in the
Yeah.
American context, because we don't have a multi-party democracy where there's any chance for an actual left-wing party. So we're stuck with this two-party system, and what we have now is a situation where the more right-wing of the two parties, although I think that's hard to argue depending on the issue, but the nominally more right-wing of the two parties, the Republicans, have now become a basically a neo-fascist party.
And do you think some of the tendencies that we've been talking about from within the left are also contribute to that rightward shift, to that great moving rightwardness in the U.S. that is, the censorious libertarian tendencies, which really, like, I would say, are in stark contrast to the strong tradition of anarchistic libertarianism on the left. But there's been an interesting shift in ideological positionality, or however you want to refer to it.
Yeah.
And so I wondered, do you think that is contributing or has contributed to the appeal of the right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, polls show that if Bernie Sanders had been running against Trump, Bernie Sanders would have won, but not in the case of Hillary Clinton. And in the polls, so and that the what people were looking for in Trump was some kind of solution to their problems, and that's what they were looking for in Sanders too. But people generally didn't feel like Hillary Clinton was going to offer that. To take the example of the 2016 election, because many people saw her as representing the interests of the elite, and somehow saw Trump as somehow less elitist, which is amazing, but true anyway. That a lot of people somehow viewed him as more of an outsider, despite his $1 billion and whatever. But yeah, I think it's the same kind of phenomenon is happening with the rise or the growth, to some extent, wherever it's growing, of the Republican Party. Is a lot of people, and of course you can see how it's growing in Rust Belt areas that used to be reliable places that people would vote Democrat, and people are increasingly not trusting that the Democrats are going to deliver anything, and so they're in desperation looking to the other option, which was inconceivable for decades and decades.
And the elements of the cultural authoritarianism that's become more prominent on the left seems to be exacerbating all of that. And so we have a few more
libertarian
questions. What's that? Go ahead, David.
The libertarian tendency that people have is less and less being nourished by the Democrats or the left, which more and more is perceived, I think, rightly in many as far as subsets of the left goes, as authoritarian and intolerant.
So we have a few more questions to get through. I want to be mindful of your time, though. Are you doing okay?
Oh, I'm good. Yeah, no problem.
Okay, great. And I thought of one that I did not think of when I was coming up with the list of questions. You had mentioned corporate social media platforms in passing about, I don't know, 20 minutes ago now, but I made a note of it because I know you've written about the problem presented by something like a Spotify, for example. And I wondered if you could just, because I'm very interested in media studies and that sort of thing. So I wondered if you could maybe briefly talk about the problem of corporate media platforms, especially from an artist's perspective.
Well, I think, in terms of communication, and I think that the platforms are all really problematic in all kinds of different ways. Like, Twitter is so easy; it really facilitates trolling very much, and the algorithms of Facebook really encourage people to argue with each other and encourage people to see only the most emotionally charged posts, and they have no idea that this is the case, and many people still think that their feeds are chronological, but they're not, and they haven't been for a long time. And on YouTube, their algorithms continually feed people disinformation, and all this is very obvious to anybody that that is studying these platforms, but less obvious to people who are just casual users of these platforms. So I think the debate often becomes this fake debate of one about like censorship versus free speech, which is, I mean, maybe an important debate in itself, but it's sort of like covering for the real sort of problem underneath all that, which is the algorithms and how they feed how they basically warp debate, so they and this how the social media platforms function, which is not to encourage real communication, but to encourage people to be addicted to their platforms, which is not the same thing. But then, from as far as artists, from there's a lot of different ways to approach the question of social media and from the perspective of the artist. But one is that when Facebook introduced their algorithm-based feed rather than the chronological feed, I have no idea how many people were devastated financially by that. But there were so many artists who had basically given up on their email lists because everybody was on Facebook and the feed was chronological, and you basically, if you had thousands of followers, you got a lot of people seeing your posts, and it worked pretty well, kind of like an email list. But then they changed that, overnight, and suddenly, the feed was no longer set up that way. Suddenly, all your thousands of followers were not going to see anything you post unless you posted the right kind of baby pictures or wedding pictures or, video of your cat or whatever, stuff that had nothing to do with what you were trying to actually promote, which in my case, or in the case of many other artists, was their careers, and their gigs, which was why people were following us on those platforms on Facebook in the first place, was to keep track of that kind of stuff, to see where we're playing and that kind of stuff. And, and then Facebook just took that away as they can, just overnight, because we don't control anything. So the corporate social media platforms taking over our means of communication has been absolutely devastating for society, and devastating for the left, and devastating for artists, for sure. But then other things like music streaming, free music streaming platforms like Spotify, they've also been completely devastating for artists. And I would really...
Could you explain why that is?
Well, basically, it's a bit complicated, because I would say that the problem has not specifically been free downloads, or has not been artists having the ability to offer their music for free. That is a fine thing, or at least it can be. And certainly I made it work fine for me for a long time. But then Spotify came along, and that was fine when they had a paid service. But then they started their free service. And of course, as you might imagine, they didn't consult artists before they did this. They just started giving away all the world's music for free in exchange for people having to put up with the occasional advertisement. And, basically, people went for that naturally, as they would. And the reason Spotify was able to do that, to offer the free tier in 2013, was because they had just made an agreement with the big three record labels, which involves the labels taking the vast majority of profits of streaming royalties, leaving the independent artists with the remainder of it. So, which is a totally unfair arrangement that really screws independent artists even more than we were being screwed before Spotify started working with the big three labels. But that was that when they started their free tier and got the deal with the three labels, and people could get all the music they wanted, all the pop music they wanted for free, without having to pirate anything. Then that just changed the whole tide. So then people just started throwing out their sweet CD players, understandably, and so then suddenly, basically, for millions of musicians around the world, our income was cut in half, basically overnight. because for millions of independent musicians around the world, merch sales used to be about half of your income. And, music piracy, as they called it, free, illegal downloads, they affected the pop musicians and Hollywood, in a big way, for sure. But I don't think they had a really significant effect on most independent musicians, for a wide variety of reasons. But what did was when Spotify's free tier came around. That was I'm not saying that things would have not gone that way in one way or another anyway, but the way it went down was Spotify. That's who did it. And I think, in that woman, I can't, what's her name? The book, The Rise of Disaster no, not Naomi Klein. No, the surveillance capitalism, the rise of surveillance capitalism. I mean, she makes the point that it didn't need to be that this model of total sort of parasitic vulture kind of capitalism of like just destroying society in the name of metadata and profit. The model didn't necessarily have to go that way. I mean, with Google and Facebook and Spotify being these dominant players that just sort of eat the internet alive. I mean, it didn't necessarily have to go that way. It could have been a more fair model, like Apple was. I mean, as whatever problems the corporation has, like, it could have been done in a way that didn't involve like surveilling everybody and stealing everybody's content and selling it back to them for, to make money without rewarding the artists. I mean, it didn't have to go that way necessarily.
So I'm just curious, how did you react to the emergence of MySpace way back when? Because it antedated Facebook, right? And it had a reputation for being more artist friendly. And this was pre-streaming. And I remember, like, I used to, when I first discovered it, I'd go to MySpace because artists were putting out some of their music there, and YouTube wasn't very big, right? So at the time, at least initially, it may have even been, MySpace started before YouTube, right? And so that was the place to go for freely available music, that if you weren't going to, pirate something. And so I wondered, did you have a relationship with MySpace, or did you see at that point that, like, did you think social media was going to be beneficial from an indie musician's perspective, or did you see the warning on the wall?
Well, originally, the way MySpace was set up was pretty useful, and for artists. The problem was with any of those platforms that things can just change, and then they're not doing the same things they were doing before. So it's always the problem is like depending on these platforms, and of course other things can happen, like the platforms just become irrelevant and replaced by another platform that becomes more dominant, that's doing something similar that people decided was better, like Facebook. But when MySpace existed in the early years, it was useful as a tool for artists. But I guess there were other equally irrelevant now platforms that I was giving away music on that were useful, because I could harvest email addresses when people were downloading songs, which now people understand how useful that is. But back then, I think people might have thought you're crazy to be giving away your music, but actually, what artists knew, that we might not have been throwing around the word metadata back then, but any artist knew that if you could get somebody's email address, when they download, if you gave them a song and they that's a great deal for you, for the artist, because then they're on your email list, and then maybe they'll come to a show, maybe, they'll donate to an album project. I mean, there's a lot of things that can happen when you have that kind of relationship with somebody that is like they've given you their email to get on your email list. You know, that might not seem like much, but it's a significant development in the relationship between artists and their audience. And you got to have an email list, and it's a vitally useful thing. And that's and it used to be easy to directly have a relationship with people who liked your music through platforms that you controlled, and that is only the case now if you want to try to bypass the superhighways. Basically everybody's on Spotify and YouTube, and so if you're not on Spotify and YouTube, you're just not there. You're just nowhere. So you can still use the old platforms from 20 years ago. Some of them still exist, and you can tell people like, yeah, if you want to have my music for free, you can download it there on SoundClick. But people just, some people will do that, but most people will be like, oh, what's that? I never go to SoundClick.
Right. Something that I won't take us down this detour road too much further. Although I did want, I think it's good because you're a complete person, and music's a big part of who you are and what you do. And so I wanted to touch on that in the interview. Mm-hmm. So I don't mind the detour if you don't object too much.
No, but, not at all.
I was I noticed. Just from, I guess, a consumer's perspective, or a music fan's point of view, that when artists make singles or albums available now, they're primarily through the dominant platforms, and oftentimes you can't. I mean, you could acquire this file in other ways, but you can't easily just download the MP3. Like, you either have to get it on Amazon or iTunes or YouTube or Spotify, or insert your preferred corporate platform there. And that's so bizarre to me, right? Like, the actual file that contains the music is not easily available oftentimes anymore, just individually. Have you noticed that as well? And like, did that strike you as kind of odd when that, or at least unfortunate, given the monopolization of the platform?
Yeah.
Monopolization?
Yeah, I think it's very strange, but it's certainly the way things are going. I mean, people just they just live in the Spotify universe, and they got all their playlists organized in there. And I mean, if you've gotten into Spotify, then it's very understandable why people have just sort of given up on collecting MP3s or anything else, and just figure that they'll have a Spotify membership. I mean, if they're really serious about listening to music and they don't like ads, then they'll pay $10 a month for it. And it's pretty impressive what Spotify has actually achieved, because it used to be, I think 20 or 30 years ago, the average music consumer, the average person bought $45 a year worth of CDs or other physical stuff. And now the average music consumer spends $80 a year on streaming. So that's there's people are spending more now, but the money isn't going into the artists. I can tell you that. I mean, artists that used to make, like me. I mean, I used to sell hundreds and hundreds of CDs a month on a typical tour, just playing, gigs for 30, 40 people, those kind of shows. I'd sell in a given month hundreds of CDs, and that was a lot of artists did that. It was half of their income, but it represented tens of thousands of dollars a year for so many artists, and now from 2 million or 1 million songs streamed a year on Spotify approximately. That breaks down to getting something like $250 a month. So it's about a tenth of what I would have made before selling CDs. So I mean, it's a hard comparison to make, because it's not exact, like we're talking about some cross between CDs and radio, because it's not like people are like, as you say, they're not collecting MP3s anymore. They're just doing the streaming. So it's a new category, I guess. It's not quite radio, but it's not quite collecting music either. It's it's its own thing. But
so to bring us back, and maybe this will be a segue that can do it, because I made another comment as you were talking, and when I first asked about the social media, you'd mentioned you didn't use this term, but this is the term that came to mind, the emotionally potent oversimplifications. I think that's like it's a I don't think Noam Chomsky coined it, but he certainly popularized it in relation to conventional mass media primarily, and the conditions of concision and other institutional and ideological filters that produce certain types of news, including the sensationalist variety and whatever you can fit into that short little time slot, or the headline, or whatever. And oftentimes it's going to appeal to our base instincts, because that's going to get clicks, right, to translate into the online world. And I was thinking that there's a lot of discussion among folks who study media as to whether, I don't know if there's a lot of discussion, but there's some, as to whether and to what extent that propaganda model of the mass media that Herman and Chomsky formulated back in the 80s with respect to the traditional media, if to what extent it applies now in the new media sphere. And I think that's one strong parallel, how the algorithms sort of reproduce that emphasis on emotionally potent over simplifications that elicit these kind of knee-jerk reactions that get us really fired up and angry. Matt Taibbi wrote a book called Hate Inc. Why Today's Media Makes Us Despise One Another, something like that. And there's an interesting connection between what's going on in the still existing broadcast sphere, but how the same sorts of reactions that are elicited, you get that reinforced online through social media. And I think what we've talked about already, the censorious tendencies and the left eating itself. I don't think that that helps matters much. And actually, maybe this is a good way to segue into what I wanted to ask about, which is a new song that you put out. You recorded a new song late last month titled "Cancel Culture Commander: Ballad of an Anarcho-Puritan," and I think it's pretty great. One of the reasons that I'll say that is because I play basketball on occasion. I'm only 5'2", so not the greatest player in the world, or even good by most standards, but I'm okay, a little bit of handle. And there's sort of an ethic that prevails when you're hooping, and I'm not even great about adhering to it because I'm a smaller guy. But like, if somebody's playing you hard, you don't typically just resort to foul calling constantly. You play them as hard as they're playing you. Right. And I appreciate that approach, which I think you've taken here, rather than just being bullied, kind of standing up a little bit for yourself and doing what you do best, which is make music. And so I wonder if you could explain the concept behind that Cancel Culture Commander song. And you do mention somebody explicitly, Shane Burley. So I wondered if you could comment on your beef with Burley, or his beef with you, as it were.
Yeah, well, so I mean, I just first of all completely agree with the tendency of social media, the way the algorithms are set up to do exactly what Chomsky and Herman talked about the corporate media doing, the way it's set up, and it's fascinating because I think it's fascinating how both of those things work, because in both cases you're talking about so many actually good, well-meaning people engaging in these kinds of really toxic, bad behaviors and spreading disinformation without necessarily even wanting to, in many cases, And I think with the mass media, the way that they set it up with the editors, there's powerful people who decide what these reporters are going to do, what stories they're going to do, who they're going to talk to, and then there's only this illusion that that there's a free press, or that the reporters have generally much power to do anything. And then when they do have an assignment to talk to somebody, they only have like 1 minute, or whatever, 100 words or whatever it is to actually talk to them. And there's certain subjects they're supposed to address. So I mean, basically, that is not really a free press. I mean, the stories aren't even long enough to have a chance to explore, in so much of the press, to actually get to the truth, and that's intentional. And with social media, it's very much the same. With the Facebook posts that tend to get seen are like a few paragraphs of emotionally intense, like eloquence about some situation, rather than the more lengthy expositions, which of course don't get seen, or the links to some blog posts, which of course won't get seen at all. But Cancel Culture Commander is about, specifically, it's about Shane Burley, who is a cancellation campaigner. Whatever he calls himself, which is what he calls himself, is an anti-fascist, whatever he means by that. But what he is an authoritarian. And who engages consistently, constantly online on Twitter, along with his colleagues Spencer Sunshine and Alexander Reed Ross, and dozens of anonymous Twitter accounts. These three luminaries who have names, who publish for various presses and publish articles and have some kind of legitimacy in some circles, these people are troll farmers. They are cancellation campaigners. This is not me hypothesizing. This is all this is all abundantly obvious to anybody that's paying attention on Twitter. And if they're not, I can show them the documentation to demonstrate that this is a troll farm. These people are campaigning against the professions of various people, including me. This is a thing that they do. So whatever they call themselves, however they pretend to identify intellectually, or however they think they identify intellectually, whatever they think they are doing. What they are doing is conducting cancellation campaigns. They can call the campaigns what they want, but that's what they're doing. And that's what I'm describing in the song. I'm describing how Shane Burley is a cancellation campaigner, specifically.
And he also does journalistic work too, and has authored a book or two. And I would just wonder, I'm curious if you've read his work or engaged with it at all.
Yes, I've read a lot of his sad excuse at journalism. Yes, and I have, and I don't think he's actually written a book, but he has edited. He's edited books written by people who include really great folks, including friends of mine, who about the anti-fascist struggle. So he has done, work that, as far as being the editor of compilations of a book, a compilation of essays about the struggle against the far right, he has done legitimate work. But most of what he writes about, most of the articles that he writes, are oriented towards rooting out anti-Semitism on the left, and he takes a lot of different sort of approaches to doing that, but but that is the essence of most of what he writes about, and most of his journalism, whether he's publishing on his own website or for Haaretz. That's his favorite theme, and of course to write articles attacking people he doesn't like as well.
I'm not all that familiar, which is why I asked if heard of Burley and heard of him, in the context of the left and anti-fascism, and then because of you. But just curious about that. Then also, has he responded or said anything to you since you released that song? And has the song been otherwise well received?
Yeah, it's been well received. But he. He most recently, on April 24th, he published a many thousands of word piece condemning me and Gilad Atzmon, who I'm apparently, it's all about me and Gilad, which of course everything about Gilad applies to me because since I supposedly support Gilad, and then he can condemn me for anything he can condemn Gilad for. So it's basically a very confused, strange, very long piece that he published in It's Going Down and in the Anarchist Federation website and various other places, with a significant following, for those folks who are into those those corners of the left. So I responded to that with an article that was quoting the relevant parts of his accusations towards me and refuting them, and also I wrote that song. But I haven't heard of any response from Shane about my response to his article or his response to the song. But I'm sure there will be responses forthcoming.
And the article that you wrote, where's that available?
Oh, on my blog at basically davidrovics.com/thisweek. It's also in podcast form, and if people would rather listen to it, because it's very long. So in podcast form, it still takes a half an hour, but it's yeah.
So the parenthetical title of that cancel culture commander song was Ballad of an Anarcho-Puritan, and you've used the term anarcho-Puritan, anarcho-Puritanism in this interview already. And so I wondered if you could offer a working definition of sorts of anarcho-Puritanism for our listeners. And then I'm wondering if you see that anarcho-Puritanism, like how it operates within the anarchist tradition and within the current cultural milieu, and if you see the puritanical strand at odds with the politics and values that anarchism has historically been associated with, because that's how it sort of appears to me, right? Like the libertarian facets of anarchism and the non-punitive forms and practices of justice and problem solving and the anti-authoritarianism that anarchism has long been about. That seems like the puritanical tendency seems to be very much at odds with that. So is that how you see it, and why? How does that work? Like how is that a thing?
Yeah. It's very complex, but I think that basically, yeah, I would say, I mean, there's among the anarchist movement around the world and the left more broadly around the world, there's been lots of different tendencies and lots of heated arguments and lots of, even worse conflicts between different factions. And so, I mean, it's not a new thing. But the basic any movement, anarchist or otherwise, that's ever been successful has been one that has had a lot of points of unity. Of course, they also tend to be happening during times when there's a hell of a lot to be organizing against and to be opposing. I mean, a lot of people involved with a lot of movements that may have been possibly facing possible schisms often found unity in the strength of the opposition against them, like the police and the military or the, whoever they were in a struggle with the authorities, trying to censor them or imprison them all. People tend to band together under those kinds of circumstances, or at least that can happen, but the opposite can happen as well. But it is not a libertarian tendency. It's an authoritarian tendency, absolutely. And of course, the left has a lot of history of authoritarian tendencies within it. So but definitely the tendency that we're talking about of anarcho-Puritanism, as I like to call it, is an authoritarian tendency, and Puritanism is an authoritarian religion. It is a completely intolerant authoritarian form of religion, was what Puritanism was all about. And, it's not exceptional in that way. Lots of other sects, Christian sects, have been extremely intolerant, to say the least. But there wasn't a Catholic church in Rhode Island for like 200 years. Not for the lack of Catholics. But for it was death sentence to be a Catholic or a Quaker or an Indian. The Puritan rule was a horrible, horrible thing. And this is the kind of intolerance that I think is that we're looking at with these kinds of people who have absolutely no capacity to reason in any kind of in any kind of conventional sense. They just cast aspersions, and they have their completely rigid belief system, which doesn't allow them to let in any sunlight at all. So they are. It is a political tendency that seems to be as confused and as based on moral outrage and seeking purity and seeking to dispel the impure and cast out the impure and excommunicate the impure. This is the tendency that we're talking about within what we might call the anarchist scene in certain pockets of the U.S. today, like Portland. And I'm not characterizing the anarchist scene generally as being represented by folks like Shane. I don't think it is. But their tendency is louder than it would than it might. It can be very loud because when you cast these kinds of aspersions, people are good people, and they're concerned. They don't want to be supporting anti-Semites or racists or Holocaust deniers or whatever, or sexists or whoever else. If you're being accused of all kinds of stuff, whether falsely or not, this is going to have a huge impact on a lot of people. But I think anarcho-Puritanism is a term I made up to describe this tendency, and but as with any other term, it's an imperfect term. It's not meant to be a term that tells you everything you need to know about this political tendency. It's just two words that I threw together that I think are representative enough of the tendency to be my favorite term. I think it's better than calling them left cancel culture, because it's not a cultural phenomenon. They're more organized than that. It's more of a political ideology.
Does anarcho-Puritanism have reach beyond anarchist circles?
Yeah, definitely. They have a lot of impact among liberals, which is why, I mean, and they have impact among anybody who's on Twitter who has a conscience, basically. I mean, if anybody who's concerned about accusations of sexism, racism, anti-Semitism, which is most good people, I think there's a lot of folks who are more immune to this kind of stuff because they come out of political backgrounds or other kinds of backgrounds where they're used to being denounced for all kinds of stuff. They're used to being called all kinds of names and all kinds of false allegations. This is very... I mean, a lot of people who have any kind of background in sort of communist or socialist politics and different parties that break from each other and all these. I mean, they're used to these kinds of false allegations or wildly exaggerated aspersions being cast on other people to make them look bad after the party split and one side wants to make themselves look like the more moral or the better, or the side that more people should join. I mean, this kind of stuff has a long history, but it has a history on the left generally. It's certainly not just within the anarchist scene, but these people like Shane Spencer and Alexander specifically refer to themselves as anarchists, and certainly it is a phenomenon that exists within the sort of black bloc anarchist type of scene. I mean, I always want to differentiate between the sort of, as much as I love many people who in the black bloc, or what we called the black bloc 20 years ago, which now people are often referring to Antifa, but the black bloc or Antifa or whatever, it does not represent most people who consider themselves anarchists. Most people who consider themselves anarchists actually don't, aren't into punk rock necessarily, and they don't wear black, and they actually bathe daily. And, I mean, it's not, you don't have to be a black clad wearing, vegan in order to be an anarchist. Anarchism is a much broader, much bigger tent than that. And historically, most anarchists have not fallen into the kind of lifestylist, definition. It's more, the people who organized the protests in Seattle that shut down the World Trade Organization, the people that organized the Direct Action Network, they were anarchists, but they were not anarchists of the variety that were smashing Nike Town. That was a much smaller little subset of anarchists that think that smashing corporate windows is a useful thing to do at a big protest. The vast majority of the people involved with organizing the thing didn't think that was a good idea. And those were also anarchists, So, I mean, like a movie, like the movie that I have not seen that was about the WTO protests, apparently characterized the Black Bloc as the anarchists and had other people from other elements of the more bigger elements of the protests that were shutting down the meetings, referring to the Black Bloc as the anarchists. And nobody would have actually done that. In reality, nobody called the Black Bloc the anarchists. They were the Black Bloc because the anarchists were the ones organizing the fucking protests for 60,000 people that shut down the WTO.
There has been, though, some overlap between the different strands of anarchism, whether like insurrectionary anarchists and movement anarchists and lifestyle anarchists, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. And would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. They often go to the same protests, and then you got the insurrectionary ones causing problems. So yeah, there's lots of overlap, and there's also a lot of people that just grow up and decide that it's, maybe not a good idea to just smash windows at every possible opportunity. It tends to be a youthful thing that people think that it's a good idea to smash windows. When in doubt, smash a window. That's usually not, middle-aged folks who think that's a good idea. And it's not because the middle-aged folks have all become conservative. It's because sometimes age brings a little bit of wisdom, and you think like, actually, maybe the best political strategy does not involve smashing the windows of every corporate store I come across on this march.
I don't usually think that's the optimal political strategy either, although I'll acknowledge some sympathies to certain insurrectionary and anarchist sensibilities and some practices. And just to, I think, maybe be fair, right, if we're thinking historically, like the Birmingham riot, right, like that was a major driver of civil rights legislation and change in the country, and also the burning down of the 7-Eleven, in Ferguson. Like I'm from Southern Illinois, so I was there in St. Louis and Ferguson and covered a little bit of it for Toward Freedom when Ben Dangle was editor-in-chief there. And if the 7-Eleven wasn't burned down, would the same level of national attention been received? Maybe not. And so I wondered, like, if you see any role for those, the more insurrectionary anarchists, or more, I don't want to say like riot prone, but that kind of intense form of direct action, if you think it can be useful for a movement, if coordinated strategically.
Oh, I think absolutely, and I think it really depends on the situation and what we're really talking about. And when we're talking about an large scale expression of outrage from a constantly oppressed element of the population, which is what we're talking about in the uprising in Ferguson. It's not the same as having, a situation like thousands of people having a big protest that's focused on nonviolent civil disobedience, and then having a few dozen masked youth come and start smashing windows and endangering the protesters. I mean, these are two different situations. So, when we're talking about, this, yeah, I mean, they're just different situations, and and also, most fundamentally, uh, tactics are better when they have mass popular support, and that does not preclude tactics such as burning down corporate stores, blockading the roads, burning barricades, torching police stations, fighting the police. I mean, all these kinds of tactics are very popular in many different societies at many different junctures in history, currently around the world today and historically, including in the United States. But a tactic needs to be a very popular one in order to be effective. And if it's a tiny minority of people who think that this tactic is a good one, and by engaging in it, they're going to alienate the majority of the people involved with the movement that they're supposed to be supporting, then the tactic is counterproductive and is also one that is often advocated by undercover cops who the movement is full of, and
Sure.
they can wear masks and burn dumpsters too, and they do it all the time. And historically, that's been documented in lots of different cases, which is not to say that anybody burning a dumpster is a cop. But,
Right.
If you want to help the cops, go burn a dumpster in many situations. And I can tell you, from personal experience over and over and over again, as soon as somebody sets the dumpster on fire in Portland over the past several years, that's when most of the people leave. And, in case anybody missed that, as soon as somebody sets the dumpster on fire, that's when most people leave.
Yeah, and I
That's
don't.
what happens.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, and I wouldn't even characterize this as pushing back, but just because I try to sort out these ideological tensions myself, and so, I'm thinking about books like Peter Gelderloos's How Nonviolence Protects the State, and also the back and forth circa Occupy between Chris Hedges and David Graeber, when Chris Hedges denounced the Black Bloc participation there, and Graeber pushed back against that, and so I wondered if how you think about maybe like some of those past tensions and how they were negotiated.
I mean, I'm not so familiar with the conversations between Graeber and
Hedges, yeah.
Hedges, but generally, I think they're both absolutely brilliant. And generally, I think specifically Hedges has his analysis of U.S. history and European history and U.S. imperialism and so many other things, I think, is some of the most eloquent, spot-on stuff I've ever encountered. But I think his criticisms of the Black Bloc were really ham-handed and coming from a position of somebody who was not coming out of that movement. So, I mean, which is not to say that they were irrelevant or wrong, but he was not speaking from a position of somebody who could be taken seriously by the Black Bloc folks that he might have been trying to communicate with. I mean, I don't think he did a good job there with that effort. He was just not the right person to be trying to do that. I mean, which is not to say that he shouldn't say whatever he wants to say, and
Sure.
but my own personal efforts to communicate with the Black Bloc, who around some of the tactics that I think have been counterproductive, I would like to think that I've had more success in my efforts, but it's a tough one because I understand, and at the end of the day, I completely understand why somebody wants to burn the dumpster, and put barricades in the road, set them on fire, and whatever else. I understand that. I appreciate that. I also appreciate how maybe if the windows of the Starbucks and the local bank get smashed enough, maybe the rent won't go up as much. I mean, I personally really appreciate these kinds of tactics, and I think there's a lot of usefulness to just keeping corporate businesses smashed on a regular basis. especially depending on how you're doing it,
Mm-hmm.
And whether you're there's a lot of different ways to
Deploy
do these
tactics
kinds of things.
tactically. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and there's also timing. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you don't if you're at a march with thousands of people in it, lots of families, and they're on a permitted march, and there's a civil disobedience planned, and then you go start smashing the local McDonald's. That's not the right time to smash the McDonald's. But at the same time, I'm not going to condemn the people who are doing it. I want to talk about the why people do that, and whether, and talk about the timing, and talk about whether they might want to think about that. I'm not out to condemn people or cancel them or tell them that they shouldn't be part of a movement. Just to be clear, when
Mm-hmm.
I talk about tactics that may or may not be counterproductive, that there's ways that we need to deal with that. And one thing we need to realize for sure is that those who are not undercover cops, who are engaged with things like burning dumpsters, have a lot of other reasons why they might think burning dumpsters is a good idea. And one of them might be because they're insurrectionary anarchists, and another might be because they ran away from home and they are really angry and upset, and their parents were bad to them. And I mean, half the black bloc that I know are actually living on the streets and are teenagers and are runaways. I mean, let's be realistic here. We're not talking about, we're not generally talking about like really, we are sometimes talking about really sophisticated, well-read political anarchist ideologues, and we are mostly not talking about really, that crowd. We're mostly talking about troubled teenagers.
I was thinking another source of inspiration, perhaps, as regards coordination and collaboration between those who are more focused on what you might call nonviolent civil disobedience, or at least the less intense forms of insurrectionary direct action, but working together with folks who are interested in that. I'm thinking back. Charles Cobb, who was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and an historian journalist, he wrote a book, That Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, about how the civil rights movement was protected and sustained by those who weren't afraid to carry guns and protect folks against the white racists in the South who might otherwise disrupt a meeting or something along those lines. But so there is historical precedent, and there's good reason for trying to sort out the differences and collaborate and not alienate or puritanize, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And so, speaking of that, along the same lines, I'm wondering what forms of organizing, resistance, collective action, or even intellectual or cultural work that goes against the grain that's going on today do you see as imbued with some potential or holding promise?
I think that there's great potential in all kinds of different tactics and movements, and it really depends on the time and place, and like in the European context, and in many other countries, I would say that there's a lot more potential promise for electoral politics than in a place like the United States, or where the system is really rigged, as Trump correctly points out, but not in the same ways that Trump says it's rigged. But the system is rigged so that there's no possibility of a third party getting anywhere, and the two parties are both capitalist parties. But I think when tactics are popular, and then they have a lot of potential for getting somewhere. And when movements are filled with optimistic people that have a tactic that they want to try to change things with, and they believe in it, and they're organized, then tactics can work. I think it really depends on. I don't think there's any particular tactic that works necessarily better than others, because it really depends on historical circumstances and the society, and how it's organized. But I think definitely there's a lot of historical precedents for violent revolutions potentially being very effective or not. And there's also a lot of historical precedents for nonviolent civil disobedience making a lot of changes in societies, and also involving a lot of terrible consequences, like practitioners of nonviolent civil disobedience being savagely beaten and killed, which was a feature of the civil rights movement, a constant feature of the civil rights movement. People being maimed for life, but in those beatings, by police and right wingers,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah. I mean, so that's it's. But of course, violent revolution also tends to involve a lot of death as well. So, I mean, there's and of course, militant social movements, that involve arms usually involve practitioners in the movement getting killed.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
Although sometimes there's a good chance of that happening anyway, like the bloody labor history, the
yeah.
early 20th century,
Which is
and
what
then
usually gives rise to the militants in the first place, right? I mean,
yeah,
the bombing campaigns in the late teens never would have happened if not for the Palmer raids in the first place. I mean, there were bombing campaigns before the Palmer raids, but in every case, these are responses to the most horrific repression of movements. I mean, in terms of most of these kinds of violent campaigns, they never come out of nowhere. Anarchist violence historically has been insignificant, compared to the violence against the people from the state.
Yeah, you just mentioned the Palmer raids, and they played a role in decimating the industrial workers of the world. You have an IWW shirt on there. I noticed.
Yeah.
I have a red card. I'm a wobbly member of the Freelance Journalists Union currently, and some would argue that the IWW has had a little bit of a resurgence as of late. I would say the FJU has played a role in that, as has the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, which helped coordinate the nationwide prisoner, what were styled as nationwide prisoner strikes a couple years back. And so I'm curious. And then also you could argue, as some have, that the IWW organizing in Starbucks stores in the early aughts helped lay the groundwork for the unionization campaign that's going on currently. You can maybe draw a little bit of a through line there. And so I'm just curious if you think the IWW has had that resurgence, as I characterized it, and if you think it can play a role in important role in social change today.
Yeah, I think so, and I think also that just the idea of the IWW and the kind of organizing principles, and also the concept of the union also in many other ways, like when people discover the history of it as well, and there's a lot of the IWW is especially relevant today in terms of all these disparate workplaces with gig workers and people who are not in the kind of traditional workplaces that are easier to organize by big unions. I mean, I think there's a lot of promise for IWW style organizing to sweep the service sector, but I think there's also a lot of obstacles, and it's got to become a much bigger popular movement of organizing if that's going to happen. But it is also, there's indications that this kind of thinking is more and more widespread, and more people in different small workplaces like Starbucks and bigger places like Amazon warehouses are getting the idea that nobody's going to come rescue them from the AFL-CIO. If they're going to organize, they got to do it themselves, and so that's a real DIY kind of ethic, and definitely. I mean, I think the IWW is all over the place with these different groups. I mean, there's lots of people who have some degree of background with the IWW, at least conceptually, who are part of the different efforts in lots of different towns.
And another area that's potentially ripe for organizing, and I'd be interested if IWW folks, if fellow Wobblies, were to maybe get more involved in this area of organizing too, which would be around rent, tenants' rights, pushing back against landlords. You have a song called "Landlord" and one titled "Just a Renter." like them both. We'll talk about your songs a little bit later. But where do you see the struggle over rent and housing and tenants' rights and the like headed? And do you have any ideas how it might be improved? Because I know you've been, at least from what I can tell from afar, somewhat involved in that there in Portland.
Yeah, I mean, and since I've moved to Portland, my rent has gone up by 250%, and that's totally normal for people all over the city, and of course in lots of other cities. And so, yeah, I've been involved with Portland Tenants United, and writing a lot of songs and singing at protests and different things like that. Basically, the usual musical involvement. But I've also been involved a little bit with some organizing efforts, and I think it's really the biggest issue we face as a society today. I mean, other than maybe climate change. I mean, this, and and it ties right in with climate change, because we can't possibly deal with climate change until we deal with the capitalist real estate market. Because I mean, everybody's just, the cities are just expanding, and out of necessity, people are buying houses further and further away that involve more and more driving. And because everything's less and less affordable, and this kind of situation has to be controlled by government regulators and by laws. You can't just leave everything on the free market so the capitalists can charge whatever they want, which is the situation now. You got these massive real estate companies and banks, and running whole operations where they're not even selling real estate anymore. They're just renting thousands and thousands of apartments and having management companies to run their rental operations. It's really like it's really like royalty and peasants, and more, and it's unsustainable. And you got whole generations that don't even have a hope of trying to buy a house. Where that's just a ridiculous thing to even dream about. Where prices are just so impossible compared to what people make. It's
I have no hope of ever.
No, me neither.
Right now I'm renting this studio unit, which is in the back of a larger front house, and it's incredibly overpriced, and the rent keeps going up. My landlord is really frustrating me at the moment, so the talking to you about this is really resonating.
Yeah.
And so I also wanted to ask about music a little bit, and what kind of music and other art forms are you into today? Like, what's resonating with you and why? And is there anything that you'd like to hear or see or read more of?
Oh gosh. I mean, I don't really pay much attention to trends, but there's just so many artists out there that are wonderful, and that has been the case for decades. And there's always new ones coming on to the scene, and there's always old ones dying. But it's a continuum, and there's all kinds of different artists I could mention that I think are doing great stuff. But in terms of musical styles, I mean, certainly the impact of hip hop would be impossible to overstate, but I'd say that's true of a lot of different musical styles that have been that have had a huge impact on every other form of music, which as hip hop has done. But I mean, that's one of those things where I think you can hear the hip hop influence in so many different artists that at this point that it's like you don't even notice it anymore. It's pervasive. But that's I guess most of my favorite artists I wouldn't necessarily characterize as hip hop artists, but definitely hip hop's all over the place. and but I guess I always have a hard time sort of talking about musical genres or styles or trends, because I just think that the world is just full of people, and there's a lot of them who are making music, and there's just so much going on. There's as many different sort of forms of music as there are people and small communities, and the genre thing was always something that the industry, that the music industry invented, and that of course journalists talk about because they need to have words to talk about these things. But I think for most of the musicians, they resist the whole concept of genre.
So do you have any current plans for your own craft, intentions to experiment or go in new directions artistically, or hopes for any collaborations going forward, or do you have any new songs or albums in the works? Anything you can share with us?
Oh, lots of hopes for lots more collaboration. I love doing the collaborations, and been making a lot of recordings over the past couple of years, but I don't have any particular plans coming up to make new recordings specifically, but that'll change soon, I'm sure. Yeah, no.
Okay. And so on the subject of music, I wanted to mention that my top 5 David Arovik songs, if you'll permit me to share, and this is in no particular order, it would take me much longer I'd have to think much harder about how I'd rank them if I could even do that. But I would say Ballad of a Wobbly, although I will qualify or specify the initial version that you put out, not the one that appeared on the album that you released later, which was good. I like the rawness of the first one. And then let's see, I Remember Warsaw, which I played at the end of a podcast with your permission, a podcast that I was co-hosting a while back. And then also Just a Renter, which I had mentioned previously, and probably the last Lincoln Veteran. Although honorable mentions include St. Patrick's Battalion, that song about the legendary Greek riot dog, your song about 1848, and the one about robber barons. And there are quite a few that I enjoy, but those would be maybe my top ones. And so I wondered, where do those songs fit in your own list, or if you have a different top 5 of your own work?
I don't have a top 5 because I keep on discovering songs that I forgot, and then I think, oh, this is a really good song, and that happens a lot. So I don't really, but I'm always interested in what other people's favorites are, and it's been one of the most fun things about Spotify has been to see which songs other people are listening to. Although I think that has as much to do with whether it was recorded with a band as anything else, because those are the songs that people tend to like. The ones that are solo acoustic, if I didn't record them with a band, then they almost never become one of the more popular ones on Spotify.
That's interesting, because I like the man with his guitar just doing his thing. Although I will also say, and I hope I didn't skip over this, but I meant to mention Behind the Barricades if I didn't. That's my top 5. So yeah, Ballad of Wobbly, Behind the Barricades, I Remember Warsaw, Just a Renter, and The Last Lincoln Veteran, if I was forced to choose. And I really like your duets with Lorna McKinnon. And the Just a Renter, the one that you did with her with the cello, I like the cello stuff too. Like, yeah, that was really fire. I don't know if you have any plans to return to the cello anytime soon, but
I do want to get more into playing. I've just gotten it back out recently, and I've been really into mando related instruments like the octave mandolin.
Are you going to be performing or recording with McKinnon again anytime?
I hope so. I don't have particular plans to, but I really want to. We just had a gig together a couple nights ago with me and her and another singer named Kamala Emmanuel, and it was wonderful.
And McKinnon's based in Scotland, is that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So is there anything, David, that we didn't touch on that you think might be important to share as far as this interview is concerned?
No, I think you covered a heck of a lot of ground in the past 2 hours.
I try. Well, thanks, David, for participating in this first ever Waywards video interview. I really appreciate it.
Oh, excellent. I'm glad to be your first. Thank you, James. It's been a pleasure, really. Yeah. And